This is Dialogue Assassination with Research Specialist Mae Brussell. For KLRB, I'm Gloria Barron. Well, Mae, I know we want to get right into it because I see that you have a pile of research in front of you, and I see automation.
Article on Robert Kennedy. Yes. Yeah. No matter how much material I plan to bring in during the week to discuss on the show, Gloria, the morning news comes first. I get up and read the two papers before I come in here, and I try to keep everything current. And this morning, the newspaper said a second gun probe ends the Sirhan RFK trial. The suggestion that Sirhan might not have killed Robert Kennedy has been brought up by persons in Los Angeles, and now the newspaper says a 5-month investigation into the reports of a second gun have been denied, and they say that Sirhan did act alone. The district attorney, Joseph Bush Jr., said, "We are satisfied that Sirhan killed Senator Robert Kennedy." The controversy, touched off by Barbara Warner Blair, attempted to block the promotion of Dwayne Wolfer, a criminologist in Los Angeles. Now, we have talked about that on this show since June the 30th, when we first began our series. That was 15 weeks ago. And at that time, it was a very secret thing in Los Angeles. The Associated Press, the United Press were not carrying the story of the alleged assassination of Robert Kennedy by another person who's been named in a suit in Los Angeles in the Ambassador Hotel. And Barbara Blair is an attorney who was blocking the promotion of Dwayne Wolfer on the basis of the mishandling of evidence. And she brought into attention a suit that was filed in Los Angeles in 1970 against the Los Angeles Police Department. And I'm going to go back to that suit because the newspaper article said this: the district attorney in Los Angeles said the case was closed, that Mr. Wolfer made a clerical error in labeling the trial exhibit envelope containing 3 bullets that were test-fired from a gun wrenched from Sirhan's hand. What they said in Los Angeles, now the Attorney General's office down there said, people are trying to make something out of nothing. You will never put an end to the theories of people who think there were 2 guns. But the mislabeled envelope had the substitute gun serial number on it, and the package contained 3 bullets. They said it was a serious clerical error because it kicked off another investigation. Now, I'm going to repeat what the district attorney in Los Angeles said. That some people are trying to make something out of nothing, that the bullets were simply misplaced in the wrong envelope. And I call attention to the letter the Attorney General of our state, Evelyn Younger, sent out, stating that there were people who will always talk about conspiracies. He questioned the motives of those people. He sent a letter to KLRB referring to my mentioning him constantly on this show, and he sent one to the Los Angeles Times because of the ballistic evidence. The District Attorney of Los Angeles, the Attorney General of the state of California, do not want you to think anything happened except that 3 bullets were labeled in the wrong envelope. So I had a lot of material prepared for today, but I'm going to read you an article, part of an article that was published in 1970, August 1970, and I have many documents to add to this, but I want to show you what kind of people he's talking about when he says that they want to make something out of nothing. The article that I refer to is from Computer and Automation, dated August 1970. And it begins this way. In May 1970, Computer and Automation published a long article by Richard Sprague, a computer professional and the president of Personal Data Services, entitled The Assassination of President John Kennedy and the Application of Computers to the Photographic Evidence. On June the 4th, 1970, in Los Angeles, Attorney Godfrey Isaac filed a legal complaint against the Los Angeles Police Department and the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office on behalf of his client, Theodore Chirac, a former TV newscaster who was on the scene when Robert Kennedy was murdered. And he charged the police department with deliberately, intentionally, and knowingly suppressing fact and evidence relating to the assassination of Senator Robert Kennedy on June the 5th, 1968. As a result of these 2 facts, We are publishing in this issue some important articles and reports dealing with the assassination of Senator Robert Kennedy and raising three important questions. Whether or not a second gunman actually killed him, whether or not there was a conspiracy, whether computers can deal with large quantities of evidence. The May article on President John Kennedy's assassination flatly asserted the thesis that Lee Harvey Oswald was not the sole assassin, that there was a conspiracy that successfully killed President Kennedy, and the Warren Commission conclusions were false. The articles printed in this issue on Senator Robert Kennedy's assassination say that there is important evidence and strange silence on the part of the police and other authorities that indicate, number one, there was a conspiracy, number two, there was a second gunman, three, there has been extensive silence about critical questions and extensive suppression of critical evidence. We shall show beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Los Angeles Police Department, in particular Mr. Robert Houghton, at the time Chief of Detectives, LA Police Department, have suppressed extremely important information. By applying computers to the collective facts of each assassination, computer people can diminish the credibility gap and perhaps find a more complete and accurate account for the assassination of the Kennedy brothers and Martin Luther King Jr. Because of garbage in and garbage out, computer professionals are intimately concerned with the accuracy and completeness and the factual truth. Consequently, in those areas of political activities where factual truths are being systematically concealed and factual lies are being more or less systematically told, a computer professional has a responsibility of searching for truth. We are computer people. We are also Americans who need information in order to exercise the democratic powers as citizens of the United States to the fullest extent. A large amount of the vital information that we need in this role is not published by the established newspapers or magazines, and it appears to be in the less reputable news media, and it seems that they have an axe to grind, and this is unfortunate. In the case of the assassination of Senator Robert Kennedy, the investigation was almost entirely carried out by a special task force selected by the police department. This force was under the direction of Chief of Detective Robert Houghton, Special Unit Senator. After 4,818 interviews and many other official actions, they officially closed the investigation July 25, 1969. A 10-volume report of Robert Houghton, Chief of Detectives, was titled An Investigation Summary to the Senator Robert Kennedy Assassination. These 10 volumes are the official account of the investigation. Only 3 copies apparently exist anywhere. In the conclusions, Robert Houghton said not one shred of evidence exists at this date to indicate any conspiracy in the death of Robert Kennedy. But since this book contains no index, Computer and Automation has since made an index of that book. And they point out just some significant questions that they are going to put into the computer. Question 1, how many bullets were found in people, in walls, when Senator Kennedy was assassinated? Answer, no answer to this question is found in the book, but the evidence exists that there were 10 bullets found, whereas Sirhan's gun contained no more than 8. Question 2, what is the list of all the persons with and near Senator Kennedy at the time when he was shot? Answer, no answer to this question is found in the book. He also said which of these persons had guns, and no answer was in the book. Question 3, a temporarily employed hotel guard was accompanying Senator Kennedy and drew his revolver at the time Sirhan shot at Kennedy. What was his name? What information about him is found in Houghton's book? Answer, his name was Thane Eugene Cesar. He's mentioned in one sentence in the book, and no other information is given in the book. Now, I'm ending the quote here. Computer Automation has a long article with where the bullets were found. One recovered from Kennedy's head in the Good Samaritan. One was from his back, his neck. One from Paul Schrade's head. One from Elizabeth Evans' forehead. One recovered from the abdomen of William Weisel. One from the left thigh of Ira Goldstein. One from the lower left leg of Irvin Stoll. 2 from the center divider in the pantry. 1 from the door frame. Total 10 bullets from an 8-shot revolver. Then Computer and Automation has a diagram of where the people were standing, and the theory that there were two men with guns drawn. I have another whole issue of computer automation, which has the charges of Barbara Blair that were made out with criminalist Harper from Pasadena. And we have done these on a show, and I also did it on KIDD with Dick Bragg. And I will bring that in next week because I don't want to do the whole show on Robert Kennedy. But I want you to know, and we're going to refer to that suit in Los Angeles against the police department in lieu of something else that came up in the news today. We're talking about bullets that don't match the gun that is there. The direction that the bullets came from doesn't match where they said Sirhan was standing. The ballistic evidence that Barbara Blair is talking about that's going on in Los Angeles has absolutely nothing to do with whether the bullets were in one envelope or another. And at this point, it's just up to the people of California to say that answer is not, the case is not closed. If you people are satisfied with that answer, well and good, you take it from there. But this isn't what it's all about. We've talked about it for weeks. This is the most incomplete kind of an answer. It's the kind of an answer Adolf Hitler gave to people when he was accused of his lies. And Gloria, I hope that we every week bring this up. I don't want people to think that that is the answer.
Well, if nothing else, the carelessness of the police department should pique the ire of Los Angeles people.
Well, of course it should. And I don't think... Now, when we came here last week, we were talking about Charles Manson and the Tex Watson case. And the very day that we were doing this show, a statement came out that Charles Watson now has been convicted along with Charles Manson. And the Los Angeles Police Department made the statement, this is the final chapter of the Tate Bianca murder. All 5 killers have been convicted and justice has been served. Now, we'll do a little more on this show. I'm going back to the Manson program we did last week and show you that this isn't the final chapter of this thing. And as a matter of fact, I could do it right now because we made our show last week, and the very next day, Esquire magazine came out with an article on the Charles Manson case, an author by the name of Ed Sanders. And I want you people who are listening, because I have a lot of people who are following now. I think I've gotten into their heads what I'm trying to say and what I'm trying to do. And I'm going to talk slow. I want you to get your pencil now, and I want you to write down the Esquire magazine of this month, and I want you to buy it or borrow it or sit with a group and hold it and read it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that article because Ed Sanders came out with a book which I bought this week, the same author who wrote the article in Esquire. And it's called The Family. And I made the statement that the Manson people, Tex Watson, were agent provocateurs. We defined that word on our last program. They were people dressed up in costumes of supposedly to be hippies because they used drugs, because they were free with their sex and had beards. They were supposed to be hippies. They were racist. They were Nazis. They were anti-black. They had no part of the flower scene or the hippie scene at all except to take on all the outward role. They were products of Manson, of our prison system, I said before, and what is worse is that Charles Watson is the product of a Puritan ethic, a repressed, acceptable member of our society, and in order to justify his slaughters, we put him with all the garb, put him in a bus, and called it a hippie massacre. Now, when you take your Esquire article and you hold it, and people will have to bear with me who didn't hear their program last week, some of it. I want you to read Ed Sanders tells you in his article that Charlie Manson was at Esalen and Big Sur and went back that day to the ranch and said to the 3 girls, get your knife. He said to Linda and Sue, and he said, get your knife, get your change of costume, and go out and do your thing. And leave a sign and be witchy. He gives them instructions to be witchy and go out and they went out that evening, and supposedly, according to Ed Sanders, the 3 girls and Charles Watson went out and went to the home of Sharon Tate and did their massacre. Now, my newspaper articles of December the 4th, 1969, one of the girls involved in this crime by the name of Sue Atkins, she was the first one to talk, said 2 men and 3 girls went to the residence. 1 man had a gun. The girls had knives. They parked their car. They were dressed in black clothing. A man with wire cutters went up the pole outside and cut the wires. They saw a parent, that's one of the boys who was killed, starting his car. He got in the car and they shot him. Then a man went through an open window and opened the front door, and the others went inside. Now, Sue Atkins, on December the 4th, 1969, said there were 3 girls and 2 men. Now, when Ed Sanders writes his book, or his article in Esquire on page 112, he says that 3 girls and Tex Watson went to the house, and he goes into all the details of the murder. Now, who is correct? Sue Atkins, who said there were 2 men there, or Ed Sanders, who writes a book and says there was 1 man, because Charles Watson was home on the ranch, Charles Manson. It's confirmed that he wasn't at the scene of the crime in any way. So we have Charles Watson and the 3 girls. Now, which one is right? The girl who was there, who was saying right off the bat, the 2 men and 3 girls, or the author later, who's to cover this thing up and say 1 man and 3 girls? We don't know which one is right. But in his own book, Ed Sanders describes, and in Esquire magazine on page 112, he describes a lengthy thing of how the crimes were committed, who was stabbed, where the bodies were placed. But then he says, this is in quotes, there were indications that someone had been there to move the bodies from the time that the girls left and Tex Watson left and when the police arrived. And he says that there was large amount of blood spilled by the front door, and Sharon Tate and J.C. Ring had not been there, according to the 3 girls and the boy, when they gave their testimony about it. There was a towel over one head that wasn't there before. The rope was tied tight where they said they were walking around. So Ed Sanders, in writing his book, notices that there are discrepancies and comes to the absolute positive conclusion, in quotes, there's indications that someone had been there to move those bodies from the time and the girls and Tex left, and from the time the police arrived, based upon the length of the ropes, the towels on the face, the pools of blood by the door. Now, I come to the conclusion that he says there was another person there. I say there was another person there. I say the Los Angeles police didn't look for that other person, and they wanted in advance to say that Manson masterminded this case. So even though he was home, they had decided, like with Lee Harvey Oswald and James Ray and Sirhan Sirhan, that Charlie Manson was going to take this rap. And the police evidence indicated, and the author indicate themselves, that someone had been in on that massacre after the others had cleared out. Sue Atkins said there were 2 men. Therefore, the Los Angeles Police Department has not looked for that other man at all. Now, that's the way I do my research. If she said there were 2 men and the trial comes and only one is tried, where is the other person? Now, we talked last week about Charlie Manson and his money and his trip. And those of you who heard it, I questioned where was he getting all of his money. When the Esquire article came out the day after I did my broadcast, it tells how Manson was in jail for 6 years and 9 months. And he walked out of there March 21st, 1969, with $35, a suitcase of clothes, and 32 years old, within 72 hours, and holding a guitar, using mysticism and the guru babble, he descended upon Haight-Ashbury. Now, I'm reading you from Esquire. In the early months, he went north to Washington State to find his mother. Another time, he went east to West Virginia. And it was in Sacramento that Manson seems to have bought an old yellow school bus large enough to hold his growing youth pack. In October '67, at the Chevron station in Sacramento, they got a new battery for $39, tires for $216. They moved the seats, created a living area. As time oozed by, they put on in an ice box, a stereo set, floating coffee table suspended by wires and pillows. They painted the bus black, and then the entire family hit the road and took a swing into the Mojave Desert, back to L.A., through Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, deep into the South, Mississippi, and Alabama. Now, last week we talked about Muscle Shoals, Alabama, and we talked about Texas, and we talked about where were they getting the money, who was paying for this bus. You see, as we talked last week, I was bringing up the question of where did the credit cards come from, where did the master charges come from. If we have time later, I'm going to read more of the goodies they bought, like they had a stock of 100 gallons of gasoline and parachute covers and automobiles and material possessions and cameras from NBC, and they were shooting thousands of feet of film and sending porny movies to New York to be packaged and sold. Who was processing them? Who was developing them, editing them? This was a total military operation, and I think that you taxpayers were paying for this trip, this bus trip for these 30, 40 people. They lived on a ranch where there was a swimming pool. But last week we talked about Charlie Manson, and I think if you people read the Esquire, and if you know people have back tapes, and if you missed it, listen to that broadcast, then read Esquire, and then think about what was Mae Brussell trying to tell you about this man or this massacre that was done to effect a change in our society, an economic revolution. It's a complicated thing to get into our heads, but I think the article came out right after our broadcast, Gloria.
Yes, it did.
And I really think people should try. If they want to understand what I'm saying, they should try and read it. Now, yesterday I had a conversation on the telephone with two people that I refer to on the show. One was Bernard Fensterwald. I called him because of something that was really interesting in the newspaper, and we're going to share it here, going on in the Los Angeles Police Department, and I didn't know if he saw it, and he hadn't. The Washington Post and the New York Times carried an entire article. It was in our Chronicle here, but deleted 2 sentences, and we're going to read those on the air. We may as well do them right now while we're to it, because we were talking last week, I defined agent provocateur, and because of the broadcast, and so many people are listening, I got phone calls Saturday from people. Listen to KPFA in San Francisco and LA, there was this agent who was talking about the double role that he played in the Los Angeles Police Department, and all of a sudden heads were clicking and people were remembering what we're talking about here. And how this man, his name is Mr. Tackwood, Louis Tackwood, and he called a press conference in Los Angeles. I'm sure that most of you know about it by now, but I'm going to give you a rundown in case you haven't seen the article. Louis Tackwood called a press conference in Los Angeles, and he's 28 years old. He used to be a criminal, and he gets off of heavy raps and is not arrested because he does informing work for the Los Angeles Police Department. And I've said that Charlie Manson or James Ray could get out of jail and do heavy things for our government police, the FBI, or their local police, because they're promised that they will get out of jail, and they're used for certain things. Now, Mr. Tackwood claims that the 2 Los Angeles Police Departments, Criminal Conspiracy Section and the Special Investigative Section, are guilty of dirty tricks and murdering, and that they're out against all the militants, whether they be black or white. And he said he had prior knowledge that Criminal Conspiracy Section had prior knowledge of the Marin County Courthouse kidnap escape attempt and George Jackson's failed escape attempt from San Quentin prison. And they let both proceed. I have to end the quote here to make a comment that my research shows me that there was every reason to believe that they knew about George Jackson, and that the Attica thing was set up because, coming from New York, prison guards and members of the prison are saying they couldn't have just taken that prison and dug those trenches and moved the way they did without the guards knowing it. The guards let it happen. And who was the hero of Attica when it was all over? A lot of people think Rockefeller is not a hero. He is. That was like a joust, I call like a middle-age type, where they used to do at King Arthur's court. You proved your manliness, through these acts of murder, or like in wartime, your generals. Rockefeller proved that he was among the men when he could do this act. He all of a sudden got in the good graces of the wealthiest Republicans who had their annual dinner in New York, and he got standing ovation for his decision. And now he's among Reagan and Agnew and Connolly and the really big boys. He's a man among men where the money counts. And he's invited. Now he's on the real circuit. He's no more liberal. If Chase National Bank and all their doings with oil in the Congo and Vietnam could be called liberal. They thought Rockefeller was a liberal, but he turned out to be a man. But getting back to the Los Angeles Police Department, and this informer is saying they had prior knowledge. I know they did, and they also gave that gun to George Jackson. I've mentioned that here on the show. The guard stood there while it was handed to him. Now, this agent is saying that they funneled money through himself. He was the man who gave Ron Karenga, head of a U.S. organization, money if the weapons would be used to kill the Black Panthers. Tackwood said that the officers had instructions to make controversial telephone calls. He made one August 18, 1965, that there were guns stashed in the Black Muslim mosque. There were no weapons there, but he was to call and make that call. He alleged that Melvin Cotton Smith, the principal witness in the current trial of 13 Black Panthers, was a police informer, an agent provocateur long before December the 8th, when the raid on the Panther headquarters was made, and that Smith turned state's evidence. He claims that the Los Angeles Police Department and the FBI have a special squad to provoke violence at the 1972 Republican National Convention, which will be blamed on leftists, the object to create a situation which would permit the president to invoke emergency powers and arrest and detain political activists. End the quote here, but I want to go off and say this was the remark that people called me about on the telephone, and said you've been saying this all along, that the provocateurs of the throwing the rocks at Nixon in San Jose, or the Oda massacre, or the Manson massacre, everything, the killing of Martin Luther King, all of these things are done at election time to gain effect and put certain people into power. The killing of Robert Kennedy and John Kennedy was to take them out of power. That was to remove them drastically, but the other was to effect changes. And this brought phone calls to the House, from people who said, this is what you're saying, that this group put on costumes and dress like the radicals and mingle with the radicals and bring the guns, and that gives the chance for repression that Richard Nixon wants. He charged that he had worked in the San Francisco Bay Area as an undercover agent and spied on militants and spied on the blacks. And it said when Tackwood disappeared in mid-September, after making these allegations, he fired off letters to the District Attorney Joseph Bush and Evel Younger and John Mitchell. He made a lot of these charges against these particular people and demanded an investigation of what was going on. And Tackwood approached the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, and Newsweek magazine, and they began to investigate Tackwood's disappearance. He made the allegations, and then he disappeared, and they wanted to go into what they called the San Diego Plan. Now, Tackwood's credibility has been questioned, but they've given him a polygraph test, and they have found that much of what he said is true. And he claimed that he has done a lot to put a certain defendant on death row, that he was used as a witness in a trial. I mean, these are some of the allegations for the people who didn't read yesterday's Chronicle. He said the two black Berkeley City councilmen corroborated that he had worked in their campaign, and that he claims he was placed there as an undercover agent. A motel manager remembers him being registered with two white men who were C-22 agents, and Tackwood claims it was at the time of the election campaign in Berkeley that he was sent to spy on the militants. The motel manager says he was there with these two white people. Tackwood is a black member of the Los Angeles Police Force. He said in April 1970 he was used and considered a reliable witness to put a man who is now on death row, a defendant on death row. He said the newsmen discovered that he did have a tapped telephone that he talked about with an extension in the Los Angeles Police Department, so he could talk to people and then their information would go to the police department and he could turn them in. Now, in this newspaper article, there's a lot of allegations about the Los Angeles Police Department and the squad and the George Jackson breakthrough, and he mentioned the Black Militant Training Center in Santa Cruz he infiltrated. There was a prominent black man that was murdered in Santa Cruz, and I'll do a story about that if I have time next week.
You're listening to Dialogue Assassination with Mae Brussell. This is KLRB Stereo FM, Carmel by the Sea. All right, Mae.
Okay, back to the agent provocateur in Los Angeles. The San Francisco Chronicle, for those of you who missed the first part of this, carried an article this week called A Police Spy's Strange Story in Monday's Chronicle about his position in filtering various radical groups in Los Angeles. And the man is feeling guilty for what he's doing. He's got a man on death row that he turned informer on, and maybe these trials will be reversed now. But the final conclusion of the article, because he's charging the Los Angeles Police Department with every kind of mischief possible, framing people to say they murdered when they didn't, saying they're going to blow up the convention when they didn't plan to do it. The final comment is what is important. The whole thing is important to my dialogue on assassinations. But this is the final two sentences in the newspaper. Los Angeles Police Chief Edward M. Davis refused the members of his tax squad to be interviewed by the press because he said an investigation is in progress. But he said a Bolshevik has been working for 2 weeks to plant a false story involving the President of the United States and the Los Angeles Police Department. I think such a story would appear in Pravda, but I'm surprised here that the Los Angeles reporters are listening to the story. End quotes.
Bolshevik.
He said it was a Bolshevik. That cover story hasn't been used. I think J. Edgar Hoover used it, like 30 years ago. It hasn't been used in 30 years. But nothing in the whole article, or that I heard on the radio, mentioned the President of the United States. So evidently, this Mr. Tackwood is talking about our President of the United States, Richard Nixon, in connection.
The only United States I know of.
Yeah, the only one. He says this, and he mentions, the Los Angeles Chief of Police is defending himself against the very terrible charges that are being made in Los Angeles. But in his defense, he brings in a whole new ball game, because he says in the last 2 weeks, some Bolshevik is tying the Los Angeles Police Department to the President of the United States. Now, I have been, for the last 15 weeks, tying in the Los Angeles Police Department to the President of the United States, but I am not a Bolshevik. And I do want to say that this is the last desperate chance, and I'm going to show you that the agent provocateurs are tied up with the overthrow of our government and the Los Angeles Police Department, because on our very first broadcast, Gloria, on April the 30th, June 30th, when we were talking about the Pentagon Papers, I referred to Mr. Nixon. I said, he's not my president until I find out who killed Robert Kennedy. He may be your president, but he's not my president. Remember that?
Yes, I do.
And now it seems that the president is tied in with the Los Angeles Police Department. So in his hysterical comment or protection of himself, now that Chief of Police Davis said that. So let's say, well, who is Chief of Police Davis? I mentioned Robert Houghton of the Chief of Detectives with the evidence of the Sirhan case, because he's the one who came out with a book on the subject. But I'm going to refer again to a lawsuit, Superior Court of the State of California, number 978371, a complaint for disclosure of information. It was placed by Theodore Chirac again on behalf of himself and the residents of California, and we've referred to this many times on the air, but I'm going to repeat one part. It is against the Los Angeles Police Department, Edward M. Davis, individually, and as chief of the police of the city of Los Angeles, and a representative of the class of members of the Los Angeles Police Department, as well. These are the defendants in the suit, as well as Robert Houghton, deputy chief of the police, and Evel Younger as the district attorney of Los Angeles. They are named defendants in a lawsuit in Los Angeles to find out who killed Robert Kennedy and to get the evidence out on the table. And the suit reads that the people of this state do not yield their sovereignty to the agencies which serve them. The people, in delegating authority, do not give their public servants the right to decide what is good for the people to know and what is not good for them to know. The people insist on remaining informed so that they may retain control over the instruments they have created. Now, end quote. We're going to continue to read the role that Edward Davis is mentioned in this suit as a defendant in the Los Angeles Police Department for holding information from the people of the United States. I got a postcard at KLRB this week from some person asking me to talk about the election in 1972, the effect of the assassinations on the election, or my opinion of candidates, let me say that in a democracy where you're not informed, you have no election at all. This is an election year, and it is my obligation to tell you that the chief of police Los Angeles came out this week and is suggesting that somebody is linking his police department with the President of the United States, and he's blaming a Bolshevik. I am not a Bolshevik. I love my country, and I want you to know the evidence exists of the ascendancy of Richard Nixon to the Los Angeles Police Department. Now, back to the suit where Defendant Edward Davis is mentioned. The legal suit says Defendant Los Angeles Police Department is the agency and the department of the city of Los Angeles in the state of California responsible for police protection of that city within the state of California and for police investigation of all crimes within that city. Said defendant does not have the right to decide what is good for people to know and what is not good for them to know. It is repeated again in the lawsuit. End quotes here. Chief of Police Davis is not responsible for sending men out to murder other men or for giving Ron Karenga weapons to shoot Panthers or to turn state's evidence to put a man on death row that didn't commit the crime. The police department is not there for that function. These are serious charges, and I'm going to tie them all the way up to the President of the United States because he mentioned the President. I didn't. The suit gets back to the fourth part of that lawsuit that I've said pertaining to Mr. Edward Davis. In quotes, Defendant Edward Davis is the chief of police of that city, responsible for the supervision, control, regulation, and management of the police department and the investigation of all crimes committed within the city of Los Angeles. And in June 1968, as deputy chief of police, particularly that investigation in the murder of Senator Robert Kennedy on June the 5th, 1968. He is empowered and has a responsibility to set policy for and to make and enforce all necessary and desirable rules and regulations of said police department. He is sued individually and in his capacity as a representative of the members of the defendant police department who have carried out and continue to carry out a course of conduct which has suppressed and continues to suppress important, valuable, relevant information concerning the investigation into the murder of Senator Robert Kennedy by said police department, and which has and continues to deprive the citizens and residents of the state of California of the full and uncensored information concerning the assassination of Senator Robert Kennedy. End quotes. Let me say this week, we've talked about on the show about Will Wilson, the Assistant Attorney General of the entire United States in charge of all crime. And I mentioned the fact of his involvement in the stock fraud in Texas, and he was named in this $1 million swindle, the attorney for people who are up to their neck in a criminal case down there, a matter dealing with a lot of money and power in the state of Texas. Will Wilson was the Attorney General of the state of Texas. He was a Democrat who Richard Nixon selected under John Mitchell to become a Republican head of our Justice Department. Just like John Connally was a Democrat, chose to become Secretary of our Treasury. I've told you we have had a one-party system since the election of 1960. Democrats and Republicans, the boundary doesn't exist. We're talking about 1972 elections. We're talking about the murder of a candidate. We're talking about the Los Angeles Police Department. We're talking about our own state of California. And these are serious matters because the man who is in charge of that police department down there has brought up himself the name of the President of the United States. And somebody in Los Angeles, he says, in the last 2 weeks is tying the police department to the President. So everyone who's out there listening, we talked about the Syrian thing in LA, don't let it drop. Keep your ears open. Keep your eyes open. Buy extra papers. If you don't take them. It's better. And begin to read what's happening. Now, if Will Wilson can resign as the Assistant Attorney General of the United States, and he resigned, I don't say that he shouldn't even be subject to the same laws of what's going on in that thing in Texas. He should be prosecuted if he's guilty or had knowledge of what his clients were doing or helped them do it or find legal loopholes to get out of what they were doing. But our own Attorney General of the state of California is named as the defendant in the suit. And people like Angela Davis are asking for fair trials, and Rochelle McGee. How are these people going to get fair trials if the evidence is true that the police department and the district attorney down there are planning evidence against them? In the George Jackson thing is mentioned here. Now, if the Attorney General of our state is the defendant in a suit, he should either stand up to that case now or resign as the Attorney General of the state of California. If the Attorney General in Washington, second under Mitchell, steps down, then Evelyn Younger, as the defendant, must either answer the charges or step down too. And I'll read you, just as long as I have a copy of that legal suit that is pending in Los Angeles, and I read you about Edward Davis, we'll go on to defendant Evelyn Younger. Quotes, defendant Evelyn Younger is, and at all times herein mentioned, has been the district attorney of the county of Los Angeles, state of California. Pardon me for interrupting once more. He was the district attorney of Los Angeles when the suit was filed, and even being named a defendant in a suit, he was elected the attorney general of the state of California. That's how informed you are as to the election and who is running for office. Getting back to the suit. Quotes, as such, he is its public prosecutor responsible for the prosecution of all public offenses. He is responsible for the supervision, control, regulation, and management of the office of district attorney and each and every member thereof, and for the trial of all felonies committed within the county of Los Angeles, and particularly that trial known as the People of the State of California versus Sirhan Bashar Sirhan, alleging the murder of Senator Robert Kennedy. He is empowered and has the responsibility to set policy and enforce all necessary rules and regulations. He is sued individually and in his capacity as representative of the members of the office of the district attorney who continue to carry out a course of conduct that has suppressed and continues to suppress important, valuable, relevant information concerning the investigation of the murder of Senator Robert Kennedy. And he continues to deprive the citizens and residents of the state of California of the full and uncensored information concerning that murder. Now, that is just part of the suit. It's a long suit. We could read it for 1 hour because people don't know that this suit even exists. I talked to a radio station in San Francisco this week. They don't know this exists. That this is a serious problem in the state of California. And if you want justice, you know, on a talk show this week, a gentleman called in. I think he was from Seaside. He found it very depressing to talk about political assassinations, and he said, "Why don't you just go home and relax and eat some blueberry cake? Because anybody who's nominated that represents the will of the people is going to be killed." So he says, "Just forget about it. You know, no Bobby Kennedys or anyone who comes along that represents our wishes is going to be killed." And I know the man was very flippant, but I know that there was a grain of sadness in what he was saying, to just pick up the telephone and feel that gloomy about it. And I said, I tried to say, no, just stick with me, and someday I'll meet you, and we'll have a rally, and we'll talk. And if the day comes that you walk down the street and some cop kills you, because of my research, he won't get away with that anymore, because we will stay there now and defend you, and those days will be over. That they can just barge in and shoot you, you know, when you're in bed or asleep. And it's this terrible feeling that nobody is there speaking for us. And I think in order to get the confidence back to the people and the young people, we have to proceed with these trials. These men are defendants in a lawsuit in Los Angeles. And it's very timely that that suit was filed in 1970. And it's still hanging in limbo. And it's not talking about bullets that were put in the wrong envelope. It goes into a lot of evidence. So as long as Chief of Police Davis, who's the defendant in this suit, brings of his own volition the fact that the president is being suggested. Now, in this particular case tied to the Los Angeles Police Department, let us find out what are the charges against the President of the United States in relation to the Los Angeles Police Department. How do we get that information? Now, Chief of Police Davis says that he isn't surprised that you'd hear that in Pravda, but certainly the Los Angeles reporters aren't listening. The reason he brought that up, and we've talked several shows, Gloria, is about what's coming out of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union and Red China do not want Richard Nixon, Connally, Reagan, Rockefeller running our world, or Agnew. The elections are coming up, and they can see what's happening to this world. And this is why I think that Sputnik is publishing the articles on the assassination in Dallas now. They had an issue in July we talked about in several shows. They had an issue in August 1971 tying the oil people and H.L. Hunt and the Dallas-Fort Worth area into the assassination of John Kennedy. Now, the ABC News this week, since we met, discussed a book which will be published from the Soviet Union saying that Lyndon Johnson killed John Kennedy. I've written to New York to get the name of that book. It'll be out soon. And Mao Zedong has an interview about the assassination of John Kennedy. Why are the communist countries, or Pravda, as Chief of Police Davis, talking about this? Because the facts of those 10 bullets in Los Angeles, the facts of the way our power changes hands, is so obvious to the communist countries that they are not going to stop talking about it. They're going to ask us to come forward and explain who really runs the country, who really rules the country. And now I'm going to jump to another subject, because I have asked many times on this program with you, Thinking Out Loud, who does run the United States of America? And we had a lot of funny jokes from our first broadcast in June about Bibi Rebozo always being with Richard Nixon and never leaving him and never leaving his side. And a lot of people never knew the name Bibi Rebozo until we got on the air. And it's really good, Gloria. We can talk these things, and I can talk about them and bring out new names. And remember that very first one on Bibi. So last week there was a series of articles about Bibi Rebozo and his holding stolen stocks that belong to the Yavatin, and the FBI coming to him, and then all of a sudden he sold them, and about the land that he gets at a low price and sells at a huge profit. And the articles on Bibi Rebozo and Richard Nixon and Smathers in Florida were very serious. But something came out of those besides all the monetary gains they make, and that is when they wanted to trace the stolen stocks or how Rebozo was getting them or where the headquarters were. They traced it to a man. They traced it to a man in the Bahamas by the name of Mr. Sturgeon. And then the newspaper article went on to say that Mr. Sturgeon was not a man, he was a group of men. And that Mr. Rebozo was receiving stock from a Mr. Sturgeon, and the FBI or investigators found it was a group of men. Now, I know I have received documents from the Southwest, and I've spoken about what goes down at Coy Bay in Jamaica. There's a group of Solidaris. Those are white Russians, the people that are associated with Lee and Marina Oswald in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, John Conley, people from the German cartels that were rebuilt after World War II. Down in Jamaica, there is something very heavy going on in an attempt to rule the power of the world. And whenever Richard Nixon has a hot spot on who to appoint for a particular job, or he's in a bind, he's always airlifted down to Jamaica. I have said that. Now, Richard Nixon is the President of the United States, and if any of his closest friends, like Bibi Rebozo, the only civilian who has a home on the estate with Richard Nixon and his wife, if he is meeting with a group of men, somebody in the United States should tell us who those people are. Are they anyway related to the President of the United States or to shape his mind? He's elected to represent all the people in the United States, and I want to know who the group of men are. And last week's article not only referred to Mr. Sturgeon, but it referred to the problem Howard Hughes is having with his Las Vegas holdings, and they want him to sign letters to the effect of what he wants done with the casinos and so forth, but they want his fingerprints on these letters. And he sent a letter last week, and it still had no fingerprints. And the court made the statement, we don't want a shadow man. Now, we're talking about covert governments and people behind the scenes and people playing roles. Is Howard Hughes alive? Is he dead? Does he have a fingerprint? He owns one of our states. He controls it totally. He's down in the Bahamas where all these people are now. Is there a Howard Hughes? Are these shadow people? Who is Mr. Sturgeon? Who is the shadow man who sends the letters with no fingerprints? Because of my research on assassination and where the power people go and who is behind it, the people of the United States should keep their eyes open to any articles on the relationship of Richard Nixon to the Bahamas and his weekends there. And it is tied in with who runs the government. Now, maybe if we find out the charges that are laid against Mr. Nixon and the Los Angeles Police Department and work on that, it may lead you to the shadow government. It may lead you to the people that pay for the political campaigns, or who say to Rockefeller, well, now you can go, you've got the money, you're a hero. Let's find out who that shadow government is, because, again, we're getting back to 72 elections. Do you really know who you elect, or is it this behind-the-scene group? Don't forget that in the biography called Nixon, Richard Nixon came out of the service, out of law school, and was walking around the San Marino area, and there was an ad in the newspaper, wanted. It was a want ad. He was looking for a job or law office, and the ad read, wanted, one man to run for Senate. And a group of people would put up the money, and he would, in this particular party, it suggested if you're a veteran, it's good. If you're married, that's better. And Richard Nixon answered the ad. Speaking of Richard Nixon's marriage, there was an article in the paper last week about Pat Nixon and her background, and it went into stating, she put herself through college. Her mother had died. She took care of her father and brother and kept house and worked her way through school. And she met Richard Nixon. He proposed on the first date. This is like Richard Nixon walks into an office where there's these 100 very wealthy people in the Southwest, and that moment he decides he'll run for Senate. He fits the bill. Now, what's going on in the Bahamas when you're talking about power? Oh, one thing before we close, you just got a minute, because there's an article in the paper today. They're running this series called The Vantage Point, Lyndon Johnson's book, and it just came out. And I talked with Marguerite Oswald on the telephone yesterday. It was Lee Harvey Oswald's birthday. He would have been 32 years old.
On Monday, yes.
Yeah, and on Monday. And we're sort of like her family. I'm the only researcher in the United States that she has any rapport with, and she's met my children, and I've been her home. And she understands what I'm doing. And she said that their installment had come out on LBJ, and it came in our paper today. And she said history is moving a little kinder towards Lee Harvey Oswald, that now Johnson is writing. He doesn't even call him the assassin. So the article came this morning in the paper, and it tells, we'll have to go into this next week, on the arm twisting of Earl Warren that Lyndon Johnson did, and we talked about a little before. But he goes into the murder in Dallas, and he said, led by one of the most urgent tasks facing me after I assumed office, I'm quoting the book from Lyndon Johnson now, was to assure the country that everything possible was being done to uncover the truth surrounding the assassination of John Kennedy. We were troubled, puzzled, and an outraged nation who wanted to know the facts. Led by the Attorney General, who wanted no stone unturned, the FBI worked on the case 24 hours a day. Some very disturbing facts about Lee Harvey Oswald were coming to light. Notably, that he considered himself a communist. Second, he gave up his citizenship to live in Russia. He returned with a Russian wife, and he hoisted the banner of Fidel Castro. What did all this mean? Lyndon Johnson is asking. Was Oswald the killer? If so, was he carrying out orders from someone else? Did he have accomplices? Did he act alone? There was hope, at least, that Oswald would supply the answers. But Jack Ruby walked calmly into the Dallas jail and shot Lee Harvey Oswald, and the answers were lost, perhaps for all time. Now, Marguerite Oswald nearly flipped. She was anxious to see the book, because he no longer is called the assassin. The answers were lost. The researchers know the answers weren't lost, but Lyndon Johnson got very soft on Lee Harvey Oswald. And Marguerite Oswald felt very good that it's only been 7 years, and he wouldn't dare say that Lee Harvey Oswald shot the president. And time will prove that he didn't shoot anybody. But Lyndon Johnson has carefully worded his book that, he's not as sure. If you read what he said much earlier, it was a complete turn about face. Now, what he was saying was that Oswald considered himself a communist and had the banner of Fidel Castro. Oswald was an agent of the CIA, and he was not a communist except on a record he made with another provocateur in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. We've talked about that. He was allowed into the Soviet Union. Our State Department paid his way back. He only met with wealthy oil people. Everybody he was with had security clearances with the FBI and the CIA. Lyndon Johnson is still going into the fact, and then he gives another motive. He said maybe Oswald Castro with Oswald dead, we won't know what happened, he said, but there's stories that Castro was smarting over the Bay of Pigs and accused us of sending CIA agents to assassinate him. And maybe they sent Oswald back as retaliation. Well, I think it was the other way around. There were a lot of anti-Castro people that were mad at John Kennedy for not killing Castro. And they wanted to kill Kennedy because we withdrew from the Bay of Pigs. It was the other way around. He's taken the whole motive, but the point is that history is going to deal more kindly every day with Lee Harvey Oswald, and Lyndon Johnson goes into how he begged Earl Warren to bring up that change of subject. Now, there was one thing I did want to get, the one thing, there's 10 things. Do we have time, Gloria?
We have about 4 minutes.
Okay, there's 3 new books that I got. If you have a pencil, write those down. One was called Inspection for Disarmament, and the author is Melman. And that is the book about Germany disarming after World War I, and we refer to that briefly on several shows, and it shows how they secretly, with their covert government, clandestine government, said, we will not obey the Versailles decision, we're going to arm, and it tells how they went about and took the courts and killed the 400 political people who were opposed to rearming Germany, and how Hitler got into power. I received that book, Inspection for Disarmament. It's a historical story of Germany, but when you read the Pentagon paper, after the Geneva Accord, Eisenhower came home and said, we can't go by that, we'll send in covert men, we'll do it our way, and he set up his clandestine army, no different than after the First War, and we keep repeating the same pattern until we have a second army, a second person running this country behind the elected officials. Another book which I received was that book called Search for Justice by Leigenthaler, Leigenthaler. Search for Justice. That is the book on the trial of James Ray, Sirhan, and Clay Shaw, 3 men covering the trial separately that said the American system, the trial system, just can't work. It isn't meant to work. Incidentally, I talked to, did I mention Bernard Fencerell, James Ray's lawyer, yesterday?
Yes.
And he says the case is going good. There's a chance that the case may be opened up. That he was in Tennessee last week, and there is a new judge, and on the basis of this book, the judge may be forced to open. So, see, the individual researchers are helping the process.
Oh, it may be forced to reopen the Ray case.
Yeah, because
very good.
Because it's been academic. You know, the judges could say, no, this is the way it stands. But now a book has been published that was talked on a national TV show that Ray said there was a conspiracy and that the justice in America doesn't work. So now the judge has to prove the justice works. So that Bernard Fencerell is excited it may be opened up. And the third book was the one I mentioned by Ed Saunders called The Family. And if you buy it, because it is a bad book, and study it, and study how your mind is shaped, we could do, maybe have some seminars and meet people on the weekend that want to talk about these things. If they buy these books, there's not enough radio time. If they buy them and wrap, we're going to set a